in the silence of the Sistine Chapel, where centuries-old frescoes watched from above, a storm was brewing, not of wind or rain, but of souls wrestling with destiny. The news broke just before dawn. Bells tolled low and mournful from the Vatican's great dome, their echoes spilling like grief across cobblestone streets, slick with the night's rain. Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the humble shepherd from Argentina, had passed into eternity at the age of 88. His death marked the end of a papacy that had shaken the foundations of the Catholic Church and opened long-shuttered windows to let mercy and dialogue flood in. But as the world mourned, a more secretive, ancient ritual stirred to life, one wrapped in incense and secrecy, power and prayer. It was time to choose his successor. The conclave had begun. Inside the thick walls of the Vatican, away from cameras and clamoring pilgrims, 124 cardinals gathered beneath Michelangelo's painted Judgment Day. They carried with them not just the hopes of 1.2 billion souls, but also their own hidden burdens, ambition, guilt, fear, and longing. Among them stood 3 men, each cloaked in scarlet, each carrying the weight of potential destiny. He walked quietly through the halls of the Apostolic Palace, his hands folded, his eyes lowered. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, 67 years old, born in the Philippines, the son of a fisherman and a seamstress, was no stranger to poverty, nor to grace. For 2 decades, his bed had been a cot. His room, Spartan. His meals, shared with students and beggars alike. The Vatican insiders had dubbed him the Asian Francis, a man of gentleness and gospel fire. But Tagle had always resisted the spotlight, often retreating into silence when the noise of politics grew too loud. Yet now, his name floated through marble corridors like whispered incense. He knelt alone in a side chapel, fingers pressed to rosary beads worn smooth by decades of prayer. "Lord," he whispered, "do not let me desire what is not your will. Make me invisible if I must be. But if you will, let me burn with your light." But even as he prayed for humility, others schemed in whispers. Some cardinals saw in him a dangerous flame, a papacy too long, too progressive, too unpredictable. Others longed for his light to guide a weary church through storms yet to come. Tagle did not know who to trust. Even his own heart, aching with sorrow and reluctant hope, felt like a battlefield. In the grand vaulted office of the Secretariat of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin reviewed a report on Eastern Europe. War still raged in Ukraine. His hands, though steady, betrayed a tremor, a slight twitch of remembered pressure. For years, he had been the Vatican's most powerful diplomat, calm, unflappable, razor-sharp. He had negotiated with tyrants and whispered peace into the ears of warmongers. Some hailed him as the only man capable of navigating a fractured, post-Francis world. Others saw something colder, a statesman cloaked in cassock, too calculating, too involved in scandal. And there was the property deal. London, a failed real estate venture that had cost the church millions. Parolin had claimed ignorance, delegated responsibility, trusted the wrong hands. But the shadows lingered. "If I ascend to the papacy," he once confided to his spiritual director, "will they see a shepherd or a schemer?" He stared out the window, where rain pooled in the garden. His life had been one of controlled outcomes, of chessboard diplomacy. But this was no game. In the Sistine Chapel, every vote was a soul's plea. Every alliance risked betrayal, and Pietro Parolin, the supposed frontrunner, feared most what he had spent his life mastering: control. Peter Turkson stood beneath a statue of St. Peter, the fisherman-turned rock of the church. The Ghanaian cardinal, now 76, had weathered many storms: racial prejudice, Vatican politics, the loneliness of standing in the breach between continents and ideologies. He had advised Pope Francis on climate change, championed the poor, and spoken truths at Davos that made bankers shift in their seats. But the thought of the papacy haunted him. Years ago, he had confessed to a BBC journalist, "I pray against it." He wasn't lying. Every morning since Pope Francis's death, He'd lit a candle and begged the spirit to pass him by. But now, some saw in him the bridge the church desperately needed. A man of deep spirituality, unafraid of modernity, rooted in ancient African wisdom. He carried both gravitas and vulnerability, and even his detractors admitted. When Turkson spoke, you listened. Still, the conclave didn't reward prophets. It often crucified them. The cardinals filed into the Sistine Chapel in solemn silence. Each carried a soul heavy with discernment and dread. Behind the ornate doors, locked to the outside world, began the sacred theatre that had chosen popes for over 700 years, black smoke. No decision. Day after day, the world waited. Rumors flew like doves into storm clouds. Tagle had the support of the Latin American bloc. Paroline had Europe. Turkson had Africa and much of the youth vote. But none could break the deadlock. Then, on the fourth day, something unexpected happened. In the early morning hours, a cardinal collapsed from exhaustion and grief. His whispered last words, "Choose the one who does not seek to be chosen." That phrase echoed like a bell in each man's mind. That evening, the votes changed. As the ballots were counted, a hush fell over the room. The scrutiny dean cleared, his throat, his voice trembling with awe. "Tagle, Tagle, Tagle!" A ripple of emotion surged through the Sistine Chapel. Eyes widened, a few wept openly. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who had long knelt in quiet shadows, had emerged as the chosen light. He trembled as the realization set in. He looked to heaven, then to the floor, overwhelmed. "How can I bear this?" he whispered. Cardinal Turkson stepped forward and took his hand. "Not by strength," he said, "but by surrender." Parolin followed, his diplomatic reserve melting into a solemn smile. "Let your heart lead, Luis, not your fear." On May 10th, 2025, white smoke billowed from the Vatican chimney. The world stood still. From the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, a gentle voice rang out, "Habemus Papam." Moments later, the man in white emerged, simple, humble, eyes brimming with tears. He had chosen the name Pope Clement I, in honor of the early martyr who reconciled warring factions of the Church with love. "I am no better than any of you," he told the crowd, "only smaller, so that Christ may be seen more clearly through me." In that instant, something shifted. A child in Manila wept with joy. A refugee in Syria clasped a rosary tighter. A skeptic in Paris paused before mocking, something in his heart breaking open. And inside the Vatican, two men, Paroline and Turkson, knelt side by side, their rivalry transformed into reverence. The world did not suddenly heal, but in that sacred breath it believed again, not in power, not in politics, but in grace. In the holiest chamber on earth, beneath the gaze of God and the Last Judgment, the future of a wounded world balanced not on doctrine or dogma, but on the hidden tremors of men's hearts, as the cardinals assembled once more beneath Michelangelo's solemn frescoes. The air grew heavier with each passing day. Smoke rose, black, black again, and the world outside waited in taut silence. Inside the Sistine Chapel, it was no longer just a vote. It was a reckoning. Cardinal Tagle remained the quiet center of speculation, but new names now rose in urgent whispers, like prayers half-uttered in fear and hope. In the echoing halls of the Vatican, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi had always moved like a shadow, deliberate, tireless, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and conviction. The Archbishop of Bologna, at 69, bore the heart of a missionary and the scars of a mediator. He had ended wars, Mozambique, Ukraine. He had knelt beside the grieving, spoken gently with tyrants, and brokered peace where others saw only rubble, and, yet some feared his light might burn too hot, too long. "Too young," murmured a Spanish cardinal. "Too Francis-like," muttered another. His closeness to the late pope was both his strength and his burden. To choose Zuppi was to choose continuity, a church unafraid to walk among the marginalized, to speak the language of the wounded. But Zuppi, like Tagle, did not campaign. He simply listened, prayed, and waited. At 59, the name alone carried mystery. Pier Battista Pizzaballa, a Franciscan friar from Bergamo who had lived for decades among the ancient stones and sacred blood of Jerusalem. He was no politician. He had walked through Bethlehem during missile strikes, spoken Arabic prayers beside synagogues, broken bread with rabbis and imams. Some cardinals saw him as a risk, too young, too unknown. But others saw a different truth, a man forged in fire, shaped by the unbearable tension between faiths that had long bled for a single city. One Nigerian cardinal whispered, "He has stood at Golgotha. He knows resurrection requires crucifixion. Still, to elect him would be to thrust the church into unfamiliar terrain, into an east-west crossroads no pontiff had ever walked." From the bustling streets of Chicago to the slums of Lima, Robert Prevost carried the steel of an administrator and the weathered soul of a missionary. At 69, he now headed the Vatican's all-powerful department of bishops, vetting the shepherds of the global church. He had the mind of an engineer and the heart of a friar, but whispers followed him too American, too unfamiliar with the complexities of Rome. And while his decades in Peru gave him credibility in the global south, the Latin American bloc had not yet rallied behind him. Privately, Prevost kept a journal, and in it, on the eve of the 6th ballot, he wrote, "I do not seek Peter's seat, but if asked to carry the cross, I will not lay it down. Let it be for the poor, for the ignored, for the unborn and the exiled." From the volcanic cliffs of Madeira came a poet. Cardinal José Tolentino de Mendonça, soft-spoken, almost ethereal, was no bureaucrat. He spoke in parables, thought in metaphors, and bore within him the soul of a mystic, appointed by Francis. To lead the Department for Culture and Education, he had often been called the poet priest. He was beloved among theologians, artists, and thinkers. But in the hard rooms of Vatican politics, beauty often lost to blunt power. Some saw his potential to transform the Church's engagement with modernity, to awaken the imagination of a faith dulled by division. Others saw a dreamer, not a ruler. From Guinea came a very different fire, Robert Serra, stern, proud, unyielding. A man who condemned gender ideology, warned of Islamism, and called the West's moral decline a spiritual suicide. Some whispered that Serra was too rigid, too bitter in his judgment. But others saw in him the necessary pendulum swing after Francis, a return to tradition, silence, and steel. One European conservative murmured in Latin, "Fortitudo, the Church needs fortitudo." And yet, others warned, his vision of the Church might cast shadows longer than the ones it tried to escape. Jean-Marc Aveline of France, a pastoral mind with a philosopher's heart, Joseph Tobin of the US, the progressive voice of Newark, with a tender heart for immigrants. Juan José Omella of Barcelona, beloved in Spain, firm yet merciful. Fridolin Ambongo Besungu of Congo, charismatic, prophetic, and could be the first black pope from the heart of Africa. Cardinal Mario Grech of Malta, soft-spoken and shrewd, danced carefully between Francis's legacy and the whispers of tradition. Could he be the compromise the Church needed? Inside the Sistine Chapel, a spiritual chess game unfolded. Votes swung like pendulums, first to Zuppi, then Parolin. A brief surge for Pizzaballa. Then, an unexpected surge for Cardinal Serra, prompting stunned murmurs and sharp glances, but none could breach the threshold. Then, on the 7th day, a movement unexpected. A whisper passed through the chamber, older than language, deeper than fear. It began with 2 votes, then 5, then a dozen. Tagle, the man who had tried so hard not to be seen, who had wept in silence, who had begged God to pass him over. By evening it was done. The silence broke with the sound of weeping. White smoke curled into the Roman sky like the breath of a sleeping lion stirred from slumber. The world erupted. Crowds surged to St. Peter's Square. Bells rang across continents. Cameras whirred. Phones trembled in trembling hands. A name rang out from the loggia, Habemus Papam, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who has chosen the name Clement. And then he stepped out, smaller than expected, humbler than imagined, radiant with something not of this world. He did not speak for a long time. Then quietly he raised his hand, not in blessing but in supplication. "Before I bless you," he said in trembling Italian. "I ask your prayers for me, that I may not darken the light I have been asked to carry." A silence fell over Rome, a silence that reached the stars. Far away, in the slums of Manila, a barefoot girl knelt beside a plastic crucifix and whispered, "We have a pope." In war-torn Ukraine, Cardinal Zuppi closed his eyes and murmured, "Peace has a chance." In the Holy Land, Pizzaballa looked eastward and smiled. In Chicago, Prevost placed his journal in a drawer. And in a monastery in Guinea, Cardinal Sarah knelt, his hands clenched, his eyes full, and whispered, "God's will be done." Tagle, now Pope Clement I, began his papacy not with decrees, but with washing the feet of 12 refugee children, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. He washed their feet with tears, for the Church, for the world, for all who wandered in the dark. The conclave had chosen not a ruler, but a servant, not power, but grace. And so began the New Age, not in thunder, but in the whisper of a man who never wanted to be chosen. When the doors of the Sistine Chapel closed, the world did not stop. Breathing, it held its breath. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica had ceased tolling. Inside the hallowed vaults of the Vatican, within walls steeped in incense and centuries of secrets, the cardinals sat not only beneath the gaze of Michelangelo's Last Judgment, but beneath the groaning weight of a dying earth. This conclave was no longer just about doctrine, diplomacy, or tradition. It was about survival. Pope Francis, once mocked for speaking of carbon footprints and melting glaciers from the pulpit, had become the Church's prophet of ecology. His encyclical, Laudato Si, had woven together theology and planetary science, calling the world to repentance, not just from sin, but from apathy. He had wept for the forests burned, the oceans acidifying, the poor who suffered first and worst. He had declared creation sacred, its wounds sacramental. And now, with his passing, a new cry arose, not only from the poor, but from the earth itself. Deliver us from climate apathy. Could the next pope hear it? Matteo Zuppi walked the Vatican gardens in the early dawn, the dew on the leaves shimmering like a benediction. He touched a laurel branch with reverence, as though it were a relic. He knew this conclave was more than power. It was stewardship. Zuppi had once negotiated peace in Mozambique. He had walked through minefields, literal and spiritual, but now the battlefield had no borders. It stretched from parched African soil to melting Arctic seas. "We need to awaken the moral imagination," he said to Tagle the night before the 8th ballot. "The next pope must be a gardener of souls and a guardian of the planet." Tagle, ever the listener, only nodded. But his silence was not assent, it was sorrow. For the garden they tended was in flames. Inside the conclave, more than half the electors were now from the global south. Nations where floods swallowed homes, where drought cracked the Eucharistic. Soil, where forests once thick with life now lay in ash. Cardinals from Kenya, Brazil, Indonesia, and the Philippines rose to speak not of politics, but of people dying beneath collapsing ecosystems. One cardinal from Madagascar, his voice trembling, declared, "We talk of doctrine, but our rivers are poison. We argue over vestments, but our children breathe ash. If we do not act, our pews will be empty, not from apathy, but from extinction." A shift was felt, even among skeptics. The mood darkened, but it was not despair, it was reckoning. Late one evening, as tension gripped the conclave, Cardinal Tolentino stood before the gathered electors. The poet-priest from Madeira, soft-spoken and overlooked, read from Laudato, "Says we are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us." Then he set aside the text. "A new age is coming, not of progress measured in algorithms, but of communion, a return to mystery, to simplicity. We need not a technocrat or a theologian, we need a prophet." Then quietly he sat, some scoffed, others wept. But the Spirit, the Spirit stirred. The world outside burned quietly. A heat wave killed thousands across India. Floods displaced millions in Bangladesh. Wildfires licked the edges of Rome itself, a symbolic blaze at the feet of Peter's bones. And, is the Church debated tradition? The climate of souls darkened. Laudato Si had bridged science and faith. But where was that bridge now? Who would cross it? Who would bring not only theology, but urgency? The people waited for more than incense and Latin phrases. They needed a shepherd who saw the world as a whole cathedral, its oceans holy water, its forests cathedrals, its species each a litany of praise. A letter arrived during the 9th day of conclave. It came from an Irish woman, folded in a child's drawing, a globe, half burnt, half green. Inside it read, "Dear Cardinals, if God made the earth and said it was good, then why are we letting it die? Please choose someone who will help save our home. I don't go to church much anymore, but if you choose someone who cares about this, I might come back. I promise." The letter passed from hand to hand. Tagle read it, then Zuppi, then even Cardinal Sarah paused, the paper shaking slightly in his fingers. Could one child's plea shift the fate of the conclave? Perhaps, because the next day, the votes began to change. The 11th ballot was close, too close. Tagle held the lead, but it was fragile, splintered by divisions. Zuppi was second, Parolin third. But in the shadows, a coalition was forming. African and South American cardinals approached Tagle. A new bloc of Europeans, moved by the ecological urgency and calls for equality, especially the role of women, leaned toward him too. And the whisper spread, "He is the bridge. He is the gardener. He is the light." When the 12th ballot was counted, silence fell, and then a voice. "Luis Antonio Tagle, 2/3 plus 1. The room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Like a world that had been holding its breath for 2. Long, white smoke curled skyward, not in triumph but in trembling grace. Pope Clement II emerged onto the balcony. No grand gestures, no thunderous proclamation. Just a single sentence, spoken with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Our common home is sacred, and it is in peril." He lifted a small cross made from driftwood, salvaged from the Mediterranean after it carried the body of a migrant child ashore. The cry of the earth is the cry of the poor. Let us listen together. In the years that followed, Clement II would convene a synod for creation, inviting scientists, ecologists, and indigenous elders. He would open church doors to deeper roles for women, elevate ecology to a moral imperative, and declare the Amazon a living sacrament. He did not solve the climate crisis, but he rekindled the world's conscience. In Africa, children began planting Francis forests. In Asia, youth groups held masses for the mountains. In Europe, forgotten pews filled again, not out of obligation, but hope. And in Ireland, a little girl knelt in church, her drawing now laminated by the altar, and whispered, "Thank you." The world had not been saved, but it had been seen. And from that vision, faith grew like fire in the ashes. They said it was impossible, that the odds were against him, but in the halls where divine mystery and human ambition collide, sometimes the Holy Spirit whispers loudest through the most unlikely soul. The sun broke across Rome like a confession, slow, golden, trembling. The eternal city, ancient and weary, braced itself as the bells of St. Peter's tolled again. It was the 13th day of conclave. And the 13th ballot, a storm was rising, not in the skies, but in the hearts of 1.2 billion Catholics scattered across continents, languages, and longings, from the slums of Manila to the snowy chapels of Quebec, from the jungles of Congo to the cathedrals of Krakow. The world waited. They waited not just for a name, but for a sign that the Church, battered, beautiful, burdened, could still change. In the earliest days of the conclave, Tagle had not been a favorite. Yes, he had been close to Pope Francis. Yes, he had run the dicastery for evangelization. They called him the Asian Francis. But he was young, 67, humble, quiet, soft-spoken. A man who once rode jeepneys to seminary and refused the comforts of high office. He had never played the Roman games. He carried no faction behind him, but he carried something greater, a world unseen. Tagle spoke for the voiceless, the climate refugees, the street children, the persecuted faithful of Asia. He carried with him the scent of incense and diesel, rain on tin roofs, and the laughter of barefoot children, singing hymns in floodwaters. When reporters asked who could be the next pope, most turned to Italy or Africa or even North America. Very few said, Tagle, but some hearts knew, by contrast, Cardinal Pietro Parolin was a known quantity. Rome's steadiest hand, the Secretary of State, a master of delicate diplomacy, brains behind the Vatican's efforts to mediate the Ukraine war. Known in corridors of power from Moscow to Beijing, he was polished, disciplined, fluent in geopolitics, but a shadow clung to him. A scandal involving a London property deal that had lost the church millions. Parolin was never directly implicated, but in Rome, perception was a kind of truth. Still, many whispered, if stability is what we need, Parolin is the man. But others feared that in choosing him, they would be choosing more of the same. An age, of survival, not revival. Inside the Sistine Chapel, tensions had reached a holy fever. Zuppi's name had surged and then faded. Sarah's rise had fractured unity. Mendonça, Prevost, Turkson, all strong, all incomplete. And then, on the 11th ballot, Tagle. Not a landslide, just enough to make cardinals pause. A man who had not asked, who had not lobbied, who had only listened. He is not a politician, one whispered. No, said another, he is a pastor. They remembered his tears when he spoke of the homeless in Manila, his unwavering defense of migrants, his courage at Vatican synods when others remained silent. The 12th ballot confirmed it. The 13th ballot sealed it. The doors opened. White smoke rose. All of Rome gasped, and across the globe, a name broke the silence like thunder. Habemus. Papam. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, who shall be called Clement II. The first ever pontiff from Asia stepped onto the balcony with eyes full of light and pain. He bowed low, not to the crowd, but to God. He spoke, not in triumph, but in trembling awe. I am from the East, from the far side of empire, from islands touched by wind and water. I come bearing the wounds of poverty and the songs of a people who pray with empty hands and full hearts. He spoke of Francis, his spiritual father, of Laudato Si, and the earth we are killing. He named the sins we all carry, apathy, arrogance, and amnesia. And he called for a church that listens more than it speaks. He ended with words that would echo into history. Let the new papacy not begin with power, but with mercy. Pope Clement II would go on to launch the Pact of the Peripheries, shifting the Church's power toward the global south. Canonize saints of climate activism and indigenous wisdom. Begin reforms for a greater inclusion of women in church governance. Call for an ecumenical council of creation, a gathering of faith leaders, scientists, and youth to forge a planetary moral covenant. But more than policy, he sparked a return to wonder. The pews began to fill again, not with the pious, but with the searching. Children came, drawn by his gentleness. The elderly returned, weeping. Atheists, mystics, and those who hadn't prayed in decades found themselves lighting candles, and when asked, how did it happen? How did an unassuming Filipino, Cardinal, the quiet son of a poor family, become the most powerful spiritual voice on earth? An old Jesuit smiled and said, because he didn't want to be pope, that's why the Spirit chose him. And so the church found its breath again, not in marble, but in mercy, not in thunder, but in rain. And in a world burning at both ends, a small, steady voice began to rise, a voice from the East, a voice that said, come, let us care for our common home.